Welcome to Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristen, where we help you navigate the challenges of feeding your family and learn about the role food plays in our health and relationships. Feeding and food relationships can be stressful, confusing, and even destructive. I'm Kristen Saxena, a pediatrician and mother of 4 who's been researching and sharing what I've learned about feeding for over 10 years. In this podcast, I'll share my experience and expertise to help our kids and ourselves with everyday survival tips for real parents. This podcast is about progress, not perfection. So let's get started. Welcome back to Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristen. I'm your host, Kristen Saxena. On today's episode, we're going to talk about feeding kids with PDA Autism. On the show, we talk a lot about feeding kids and family meals, and a lot of the direction or suggestions and advice we give relate more to kids on a neurotypical spectrum. But what about those kids that maybe don't fit into those neat little boxes and experience a more neurodivergent life? We're joined today by our guest, Casey Ehrlich, who is the parent of one such child, and she shares what she's learned on her journey with her child. All right, well, thanks for joining us, Casey.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. I was really excited to talk to you today. We talked a while back. I was introduced to you through a mutual friend. And honestly, as a pediatrician, and I'm sure you'll be able to speak to this even more, we were talking about the diagnosis that your son carries, this PDA autism, and it was not something I was familiar with. So since I was not familiar with it, I'm going to assume a lot of our listeners also may be not familiar. So could you please, as our resident expert, talk to us a little bit about what is this PDA, pathological demand avoidance type of autism?
Sure. So you are correct that in the DSM-5, this diagnostic category of pathological demand avoidance does not exist. It does get diagnosed in the United Kingdom and Australia, and so a lot of the empirical research about it comes out of those two countries. Although there is a growing awareness here in the United States, and we just had the 3rd annual PDA North America conference. So awareness is raising around it, and research around it started in like the 1980s. But I think a large reason that it hasn't been diagnosed or well understood in the U.S. is because a lot of what it looks like is really, really bad behavior, the expression of it. So the way that I understand pathological demand avoidance, and the name can be sort of a misnomer, but the primary feature is it's a nervous system disability where the individual's neuroception interprets a loss of autonomy or balance, which means like equality to other people or things, as a threat to their bodily integrity. Right? So in the same way that our bodies would respond and our nervous systems would respond if we had a lion in front of us, and we might fight, go into fight flight, or go into freeze, like total shutdown. This is what happens with my son and with other individuals or adults as well, when their brain perceives a loss of autonomy. And so if you can imagine this with a child, right, especially when they're younger, right, you have to set a lot of boundaries and rules around safety and learning how to be in the world. And what you see sometimes can look like extreme opposition or defiance, which is like the fight expression. So there's like a behavioral expression, but I think what makes it unique is that it also plays out in basic needs when there's an accumulation of overriding this threat response, or if you're setting boundaries and there's this continual escalation. And of course, as a parent, you respond with traditional parenting strategies, but there's always a cost, right? Because it's a nervous system response, and so it can start to play out in basic needs where there's something called leveling or compensation behavior, where the child, their nervous system is like autonomically trying to get back into balance. And so they might stop eating, they might stop toileting or have a regression, or they might stop sleeping. So you have behavior and basic needs. And for my son, this coalesced around eating, which is why I'm here.
Yeah.
And, it is an expression of autism. My perspective is that the nervous system aspect is the part that's a disability, that's disabling. And that sort of the sensory and social communication difficulties are mediated through that, level of regulation, anxiety, and the threat response. So, when my son is regulated, you might be like, oh, he seems pretty typical, right? And with these kids, they're often high masking. So like you might see one version at school or with the grandparents and then like a total different version at home, which can make it really confusing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think it's easy to see then why it's been difficult to diagnose, because even as you describe that, you're exactly right. I think a lot of the things that maybe you might come to somebody as far as your concerns, it does sound a lot like maybe like a oppositional defiant type or other behavior type diagnosis. And with that masking, I think I would assume it's also even more difficult to kind of get under that sort of autism spectrum umbrella, because a lot of those things might be contradictory to what you might see with what you'd consider sort of more classic autistic characteristics or criteria for diagnosis. So would you tell us a little bit then about your personal experience in getting or coming to this diagnosis with your son? Because like I said, as you told me this, I was like, I don't know how you even got here.
Yeah, well, so my journey is kind of an extreme one, but I work with parents who end up in similar positions. So, my son was an incredibly difficult child to regulate. He didn't really sleep or nap and was hard to soothe, but I thought it was just colic.
And that was like from infancy?
Oh yeah, from infancy. And there are subtle signs of like super alert and like, sort of activated nervous system, but you're never gonna be like, oh, my child is autistic because they, won't sleep, right? So, he was always a very difficult toddler in the sense of like, he did have that Jekyll and Hyde thing going on of like, I just felt like I don't know how to relate to him or connect to him or soothe him. And he seems to be much better at the grandparents or at school. I didn't know what masking was. So he was like, seemed very happy there and really not happy at home. But he was still a toddler. So I was like, I have a difficult toddler. Was it within the realm of normal?
You're like, oh, terrible twos, terrible three, like all this sort of common vernacular.
But at the same time, I was like, how is everyone just like living their lives with children? I'd look around and be like, oh, look at them. Like they seem to be able to like do things outside of the house. And like, they're not super depressed and hating life and motherhood in the same way. There was something going on, which now I can articulate, but like in order for my son to engage in anything like play, building, manipulating toys, reading, like I had to do it for him or alongside of him. And he could not like do anything independently unless he was at school, right? So this was the confusing part. So like, we would build things and he would just destroy them, and he would want me to like improv things, but he wouldn't actually engage himself. It wasn't like reciprocal. And then, but still coming out of toddlerdom, we had some strange things like where my parents came to visit and he stopped talking and pretended to be a dog for 2 weeks. And like, this is actually a strategy of avoidance.
And how old was he then, did you say?
3.5. Yeah, no, he was 3. And then, I thought maybe, he might have ADHD. Like he has 2 speeds. He's a sleeper in motion. And that was always true. And then I had my second child and things really started to escalate. And this is often a pattern you see in families where like there's a divorce or a move or a new child, and then you can't give the child undivided attention because they need undivided attention all the time. And he really started escalating. Like the masking started to not be sustainable for him. So the behavior started to spill over into school. My mother-in-law, who lived in DC with us, started to see what we saw. And he started to get pretty violent and stopped eating and would say, like, I can't move, I can't walk. He stopped making eye contact and sort of stopped speaking. And like if we tried to engage him, he would like attack us. And I would like run into the street with my newborn to get out of the line of fire. And I didn't know. I had no idea what was going on. You know, it was a harrowing experience. I left my career at a large nonprofit in DC. I'm an academic by training, and I was just like, I can't live like this. Like, I have two versions of myself, and like my son is going to end up institutionalized. You know, like I considered taking him to the psychiatric emergency room and talk to the pediatrician about it, and my mother-in-law was like, don't do that, like bring him here. And because I was afraid like something was going to happen, like I was going to lose it, or my husband was going to lose it, or he was going to hurt the baby. Because he would do things like I would turn away and he would put a pillow over the baby's face or scratch the eyeballs, and it was almost like, and it was an impulse, it wasn't him, it was like a very strange thing. So he's very much a fight-flight expression. There are kids who go into shutdown, which usually get flagged later. But often families come to a crisis point. And it's not like they're like flagged in a pediatrician's office. And so I spent like, you know, I left my job. We moved to Michigan so that I could not work for, it ended up being like 2.5 years to stabilize him. And we worked through like a sensory processing lens for a while. And then, you know, when the pandemic happened, he was home with me and his younger brother, and it was like, you know, I was just like, something's off here. Like I tried to imitate like the what he had been doing at school, like, you know, little laminated caterpillar moving through the day, and we had outdoor time, you know, and we were all quarantined, and he would fight me to the death on anything, like going outside, moving from one activity to another, brushing his teeth. And, you know, when we moved, I started to recognize like how much his eating fluctuated with stress. So when we moved, he was only eating Honey Nut Cheerios out of a particular bowl, and if it wasn't delivered in that bowl, he would like throw it in your face and scream. So it was really like feral animal type responses, which makes sense because it was his nervous system. It wasn't like bad behavior, although in the moment I was like, my kid's a demon. And then I actually, as occupational therapist here in Ann Arbor, had done a training at the STAR Institute, which is like in Denver and the premier sensory research space. And they had an adult PDA autistic woman named Christy Forbes. Check her out if you're interested. She's awesome. Giving a training on PDA autism. And she was like, she came back from that training and was like, I think you need to look into this. And I was like, I can't look into anything else. I'm too tired. And so I started reading about it, and it was like a light bulb moment, which a lot of parents describe. But it was also terrifying, you know. And then I found another mother in the area through the occupation, actually not through the occupational therapist. I posted on Tilt Parenting, which is another great resource if you have differently wired kids. And I was posting about a service dog on their Facebook, like, does anybody know anything about service dogs? My kid is presenting in this way. I'm in Michigan. And she reached out and she was like, I don't know anything about service dogs, but where are you in Michigan? And then we ended up being 20 minutes from each other with similar kids. And we found each other, and she had just been to the first conference in Chicago. And ended up being really good friends, and we found like 10 other families in the Ann Arbor area, and then she and I started a podcast, and that's like how this all started.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like, I mean, my heart goes out to you because, like, thinking about this whole, obviously, as I speak with you, I can hear, like, your whole focus was on getting the help you need for your family and for your child. But also, as I listen, I just think so much about your own experience as a mother. And, like, it's just, I can only imagine just the difficulty and the stress and the amount of, like, mental anguish that goes into not only the experience, but so many unanswered questions as you must have gone through this. And just this sort of leap of faith that you're taking, like you said, leaving your career, leaving your home. And those are a lot of big changes for a family that's already, you know, maybe having a lot of questions or having a lot of stresses. But also just like is this going to be better? Is this going to be worse? That's hard, right?
Yeah.
So then can you talk to me a little bit, like, you said you were kind of more of thinking like you were working with maybe your doctor or therapist in terms of thinking that maybe this was a sensory processing situation. That was when you were in DC?
Yeah, so I have a dear friend from college who is an autism specialist, and she runs her own play therapy. So her name is Lauren Stern. I'm just going to plug it.
Yeah, man. Name drop.
Because she saved my life. So I'm going to plug it. She is an awesome person and just like knows all about sensory and floor time and more behavioral approaches to autism. So she was like, fly to Chicago. I'm going to set you up with like speech language pathologists and occupational therapists that I've worked with that I trust. And like I stayed with her for 4 days, and she and her son and daughter, and she basically like taught me everything, not about PDA autism, but just like I didn't even know what sensory processing disorder was. I personally don't have like sensitivity, so I was like, what do you mean they feel pain with like a strong sound? I was very new.
Yeah.
So she gave me that lens of like going in a different direction from like a behavioral approach and incorporating play and sensory stuff, which was like for a year sort of like how I was getting back to having some sort of connection with my son. So like we're doing occupational therapy intensively, and also I sort of learned or taught myself how to do play therapy with him. So I would like do an hour to an hour and a half a day of like just getting on the ground and like following his lead, and like a lot of it was like pretending to be baby puppies or like throwing stuffies at him and like working through that connection piece, which I think, you know, is key, because no matter what I read, I needed to understand him as a unique child. And so once I'd worked through that, and like, you know, we were on the wait list for the autism evaluation and all that with the pediatrician, that was when there was still something going on. And I was like, nothing explains this.
Yeah. Did you find that a lot of the things they were recommending for therapy were actually counterproductive?
You know, in my case, no, because I had that trusted person who guided me towards non-behavioral approaches, and she had seen how the behavioral approaches we were taking were failing miserably, right? Like, you know, I was doing the 1, 2, 3 magic and the timeouts and the, you know, natural consequences of positive discipline and all the things that like, and my pediatrician in DC was like, well, here's this support group for difficult children and you need to be stricter. And like, you know, it just continually escalated to a point where I was like, this not only isn't working, like my son has tipped into like a different state where he's like animalistic, and like I don't know what to do and I'm scared. And so she gave me the permission to be like, well, there's this other way and I had never thought about it because I didn't think my kid was neurodivergent. And like a lot of the parenting culture we have is on compliance and reward sanctions, and you think that if that doesn't work, you're doing something wrong or your kid's bad. And because he didn't get an early autism diagnosis, I was never presented with applied behavioral therapy, which is much more the reward sanction. And so I think some families who get an earlier autism diagnosis try those traditional approaches for autism, but it backfires, then find PDA as well.
And so then, your son is 7 now, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's 7.
And so then, but how old was he then when you moved? 3?
He was 4.5.
4.5. Okay. And what made you decide, because that's a huge decision. You're like, I'm not going to work. We're out of here. It sounds like you had family maybe in Michigan.
I'm from Michigan.
Oh, you're from Michigan.
I'm from Michigan. We moved to the small town in Michigan where my sister lives. It happened faster than I thought. Like within 2 weeks of me leaving my job, my husband had a job offer, which was not what we had planned on. But, the reason I left my job, it wasn't much of a choice. It was like, I was like, I can't show up to lead a team and be crying in the bathroom in my heels and suit and pretending to be together, because I'm not, and my life is falling apart. So I had to leave that, and that would have been a harder decision if it was not crisis mode. Mm-hmm. And then, we all have the constraints of finances in DC. If both parents don't have careers in most fields, it's hard to
afford living there. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. No, totally.
So we were, and I always missed Michigan, and I felt like a slower pace of life and more space was going to be easier for us. I'll give you just a concrete example. When I would try and go places with my son, he would go into flight and run, right? Mm-hmm. He'd run into the street, he'd run in a parking lot. And here, I can go to a place where the parking lot is empty. So I'm a little bit less. He no longer does that, but I just needed space and safety, and I felt like I could get it more closer to family and closer to a slower pace of life, and just more Midwestern space, I guess, of he can run into the street, but there's no cars, so it's okay.
Absolutely. No, I totally understand. I mean, I think sometimes being in the medical field, it was always counterintuitive to us, in the sense that it's you always think, well, you need all these resources. So we would get, even in Nebraska, we would have often people that lived, way out far away from the city. And I always thought, wow, shouldn't you move to the city because you have to come get all of your resources in the city? But I think that really overlooks it's nice to be able to see specialists that are probably not, in rural areas. But on the flip side, the life that you're creating in the rest of the days of life is far more important. And so I think that's an important thing to consider too, because I would always think we'd have all these special needs kids, and I'd be just move to the city. Why?
Or when they're screaming bloody murder because they're having a panic attack, and you're I'm so glad the neighbors can't hear this.
right.
I mean, there's a lot
showing up.
Yeah. I mean, it's real. It's real.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a very important point from someone living it, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of people too. So the other thing I was going to say was, can you also, well, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about, and I know it's probably significantly underdiagnosed, so these numbers are not accurate, but just to give us an idea of how common is PDA autism within the general population, and then within autism itself?
Oh, this is a tough question.
I won't hold you to it, but your understanding.
Do you want the short answer or the long answer?
Either one.
Okay, the short answer, I think, is that it's grossly recognize and misdiagnose, but I also think that's true for autism. And part of that is because of how the DSM has changed. But our understanding of what autism is and the connotations we have is changing so much. So I did a training with a specialist in London virtually, and she thinks that maybe like 1 out of 10 autistic
That's actually pretty high.
Yeah, but you know, it's so hard to identify because there are so many different ways the nervous system expresses. And there are so many in the neurodiversity movement, so many like self-diagnosed or self-identified autistics, and so that's like a shifting target. But I guess I'll just say, like, my mother-in-law had this question when I made the podcast of like, are there other kids like this? But like, and I didn't know, but we have like lots of people contacting us all the time. I've found 10 other families in my part of Michigan in my age group, and more keep coming. And then I have a wait list for my coaching. So like, it can't be that rare, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that, as you know, I think we always said, like, in our lifetime, the diagnosis of autism itself has obviously increased substantially. And then everybody's always got these questions like, is it really more common, or are we just getting better at diagnosing it? And I think it's probably maybe both is usually the answer that people will give, although it's very difficult. But at the same time too, I think we're so just still in the infancy stages of understanding, you know, and even understanding right now, we kind of have this umbrella of this autism spectrum disorder, or like pervasive development issues. But are these all even under the same umbrella, really? And I don't know if maybe somebody does have more information or better understanding of that, but I think we're just so at the infancy, which I think is why it's so great that you're able to kind of share your story and what you're learning, because it really also speaks to your experience that what we need is this, like, people need this village, really. I think in of nothing else, like you're talking about, what a lifeline it was even to come across this person on Facebook who was near you and having this sort of or not Facebook, on Tilt. And
well, it was a Facebook.
It was a Facebook. Okay. Yeah. Some sort of like online social media
group on Facebook.
Okay. So anyway, but I'm just like, just having that right now, I think is so important for parents. And I think the coaching that you do, but even just creating a space for creating connections and community for people who are dealing with this. I would think, like you had mentioned, you know, in those kind of situations, you start to feel like, is it me? Like, am I crazy? What's going on? You know, am I perceiving this wrong, or am I doing something wrong? And when you're not getting the answers that you know, like you said, I think the masking seems like it makes it really difficult because people aren't even seeing the same thing that you're seeing.
Yes.
And it's pretty unique, really. Not a lot of conditions, because people will say, well, you know, if they're capable of XYZ, then it must be something that is unique to this environment or unique to the way that we're responding. So obviously we want to move to feeding and how that has been different, and how food has really been central to sort of the expression that you're seeing, or you have seen in your son. And I really wanted to talk to you because obviously on our show, you know, a lot of the experts I meet with, a lot of the advice I give myself, I want to be clear. I mean, it's really generally for the neurotypical child, and strategies that you can use that for a child who's more neurotypical can generally lead to success. But I always like to say, you know, as a parent, you are the greatest observer of your child. You got to trust your intuition, and you really have to be the greatest advocate for your child. And if you truly feel like, you know, I've done all of these things and this is not working, or even counterproductive, you know, that I believe is the experience that you had. And so I want to not only honor that as existing in the world, and that it's very important to recognize that, but also hear, I mean, how does that look from someone who's lived it? So please tell me what feeding your son has looked like over time?
Man, oh man, it's a big question. Well, I had all these visions and expectations as a mother, like we all do.
Oh, the more expectations you have, I always say too, like the farther they're going to fall from those,
yes.
right? Like it's all going to be organic, scratch cooked from the farmer's market.
1,000%. And that's actually what I did, like in the beginning. So like he was breastfed and, for the first year, as you pediatricians recommend, and he was really an amazing eater. Now I understand that he was eating way beyond hunger because he is an oral regulator, and that's a common thing among these kids. Like my son, as an accommodation, still uses a pacifier even though he's 7 when he's home. So oral regulation is an indicator, just for the listeners. And, he wasn't a terrible eater as a toddler. Like I did the no sugar, no grains, not a lot of dairy. We also did baby-led weaning. Like I did all the things, right? And I like to eat healthy myself. And then, as I said, there was a change in the dynamic in the home. He had started to get quite a bit more picky, but not to the extent that I was worried about caloric intake and nutrition. And again, he was 3, so I was like, well,
kind of typical behavior, yeah. Dr.
Prager's spinach chicken nuggets, but there's some spinach in there, right? Like that type of thing. And it seemed within the distribution of typical. And then, as I mentioned, things really started to escalate. And my anxiety drove me to respond to my son with, you have to sit at the table. You can't have anything else until you eat this. And just trying to make him eat. And the more I did that and the more stress occurred, the more he resisted, but running from the table, having a flight response, he would gag or vomit, and it sort of escalated into the beyond what the books say will happen. I'm like, yeah. And so I honestly think that because of his sensitive nervous system and my response to it, he experienced trauma around eating. And so that's been a very delicate balance since our crisis. And, I remember when we moved to Michigan, when he was in that Honey Nut Cheerios phase, and I didn't understand, I didn't know it was about autonomy. I thought it was about sensory. And so I remember going to Meijer's. I don't know if you have Meijer's in Omaha.
No.
It's a big chain of supermarkets, and just going through the aisle of Ensure and all the different chocolate and cake flavored Zone bars and protein bars, because I was just oh my gosh, he's not eating. He's literally not eating. And his sensory stuff, and this happens when the nervous system is activated with these kids, their sensory stuff goes way up. So I would eat something near him and he would vomit. So he couldn't even eat at the table. And we started having to use an iPad to reduce his sensory input. And the only way he would eat would be under a blanket with an iPad, and I would have to deliver it to him. And still he has a pretty difficult time eating. And so, I'll give you an example, right now, and this is common for autistic children to have 5 to 6 safe foods. And I've done my own coaching with adult autistics who give a different perspective. So they don't view it necessarily as a problem as long as the kid is growing. And that's sort of what the pediatrician said in a way. But what the 5 to 6 things were for my son and are just felt so wildly non-nutritional. Right now he's eating Lay's potato chips, popcorn, Pirate's Booty, gummy snacks, and granola bars. One brand, one kind, one flavor of granola bar. And then we encourage him to eat apple slices, non-organic, Honeycrisp, and he might eat a little bit of that. And he just started eating some Faye yogurt and chewing on some steak. But in order to get him to that point, we had to really let go, because the more our anxiety and expectations around it increased, the less willing he was to eat. Mm-hmm. So it was like, and we worked through a sensory lens again before we understood the autonomy and nervous system piece. And he would make progress and he'd try new foods in food school, which is like, a 32-step process for exposure, like where the first thing you do is like, you might just like be using a toy hammer to like crunch things on the table, like very inoffensive things like Cheez-Its. Like we're not talking like a salad. And then like
they're very offensive.
Yeah. I mean,
no, I totally know what you're saying. I just love that.
Those offensive salads.
I do. I'm highly offended.
Well, most 5-year-olds don't eat salad, but yours does. I saw it on your Instagram.
Well, but like sometimes some do, but I hear you. Yes. But I'm very interested to hear this, because I am curious, like sort of the methods that work and how maybe some are the same and some are different from what we might suggest. Because and I don't mean to interrupt you, because I really want you to continue this story, but even as you described it, those early days where you kind of feel like maybe that created some of the traumatic experience he had around eating, and you felt like I thought you articulated it super well when you're realizing or self-aware now that it was your anxiety creating this situation where you were kind of coercing or pressuring him, which came from a place of love, but also generally comes from parents' own anxiety. And I think this is true for most parents with most kids, is where we try to get them to eat, period, and get them to eat what we want them to eat. And that even for neurotypical kids becomes a power struggle often, and ends up doing more harm than good in the long run, because you won't, eventually, even with them, it's a neurotypical kid, it's an autonomy issue, and they realize that they're going to win. Like, it's very difficult to actually make someone eat something. And so that really spoke to me in the sense that it was easy for me to see how even for a neurotypical kid, this becomes a little bit of a power struggle and autonomy issue. And so then for a child where that is heightened much more, I can definitely see how that became a big issue. So I'm very curious to hear then kind of how things have progressed and what you've found has worked best, because certainly like the more hands-off approach is generally still what we would recommend in those situations, but obviously for you, it sounds like, you've had to kind of chart your own path and do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to understand the mechanism of like what's actually going on. And, it's different. All of us want autonomy, and all of us want to not be sensorily offended. And there's a spectrum, right? Like, I didn't want my parents forcing me to eat things that I found gross, and I didn't want it to feel like boot camp at my meals. I think, when we identify a child with sensory issues, we want to accommodate that to the extent possible and know like they can actually feel pain or disgust. So not pressuring on those points, those specific ones. And then with a child who's demand avoidant or PDA, I think the autonomy piece is a non-negotiable. And so some of the ways that we sort of came back from not eating anything, first, I mean, as you said, like the first thing I needed to do was let go and like manage my own anxiety and just be like, I do not have control over this situation. All I can control is myself, and I can't change his nervous system. And so, I think the occupational therapy with the play element continued, but he would add something and then drop it because he was exerting control. I tried at home to introduce more like play and pleasure into eating. So like we would do things to sort of disrupt that association. So like instead of having him eat at the table at a certain time, I would like pour chocolate milk when he was still drinking it, but I tried to put powders in it, and so he stopped. put it into like a wine glass that wasn't going to break, and like we would do a picnic up in his room, and just like changing the association around it, lowering demands about how he showed up to eat. So like for us, our primary goal was like eating. So we let go of like etiquette and sitting at the table and times of the day, which can be really hard. But if it's a matter of health and safety, it's like, well, do I really care about him sitting at the table, or do I really care about him getting enough calories? And I often, to lower the threat response, deliver him food without speaking. So it's like an offering, or what parents talk about in this homeschool community of like strewing, which is like putting out things without even mentioning it. And that allows for maximum autonomy to sort of like gravitate towards a buffet of options. So that's like some of the stuff we've done that has been helpful.
So
telling him, I will never force you to eat anything.
Yeah. Which is probably good advice for anyone. But so at this point, like, are you able to eat together? Like, I know you had talked about sometimes he eats, under his blanket with his iPad, so I assume he's solo in that scenario most of the time. But then other times where you've been able to kind of like picnic up in his room, or like is there a typical scenario for you guys in your house, or where are you at with that right now?
I think so. We made a mindset shift of, again, like offering, like this is an offering. So like when I was still coming out of crisis, I couldn't even manage to get like meals on the table. I was eating frozen meals and like giving my kids food where they were. My younger son would sit at the table. But I had two dear friends from Colombia from my field research, because my past life I was an academic and did work in Colombia, Latin America, and they like lived in a conflict zone, and I was like, I am going to die, like I need help. And I needed someone who wouldn't judge the extremity of the responses of my child or like our home life. And they somehow, the stars aligned, and like one flew from Australia, one flew from Colombia in the height of the pandemic and the election year. My husband works for the Department of State in Michigan, so it was like he was really focused on the elections, and so they literally saved my life. But what they did, they were like helping me cook, and they would be like, we're just gonna set a place for him and we're gonna eat every night. Like, they decided this to help me as like my mothers, they're older than me, and we set a place, and we would set out preferred food for him. And at first he'd like run over from the couch and like grab something we'd set out, and then like by the end of their time there, we had more of a routine, and he would choose often to come sit with us. And granted, he would bring his iPad, but like he would have us do like drawing contests, like from the iPad, like we'd all draw the same thing. And like he started to associate the table and meal times with like family and fun and peace. And my husband and I have worked pretty hard to continue to have a set meal time, especially at dinner, and cooked food. And we have an au pair from Colombia, so we're continuing the theme. And we eat with her every night, and he often will come down or not be ready to go to bed, and he'll have like a second dinner with us at the table. So
that's amazing. I mean, I would think as a parent, obviously, I'm obsessed with like family meals, but like, so it just warms my heart. I mean, it must be so nice to like have him associating that with like such positivity as a change. And for you too, like just to have it be a little bit more peaceful and not so anxiety provoking every day. Yeah.
Well, I've let go of like whether or not he comes to the table. And in doing that, he often chooses to do so because he senses that he has autonomy. But that's like a huge leap of faith, right? Of just letting go of control and being like, okay. we'll see what happens.
So then the other question I have is then what's the typical scenario in which like a new food comes into his life? Because you kind of talked about right now his 5 foods are these things, but it sounds like that changes over time. So what's kind of a typical scenario where something is sort of introduced into the list?
Yeah, so there's probably three ways that it happens. Like, one is a friend from school will have something and he'll see that they're eating it and he'll be interested. It'll pique his interest. The other is, as he gets older and more self-aware, and we talk about PDA and his nervous system all the time, the more he's starting to understand, not from an emotional or sensorial level, like a cognitive level of like, if I don't eat this, I won't have energy, and therefore I need to try. Like, he's not motivated to do it for me, and I think that's part of his autistic expression. But he's like starting to understand more like energy and protein and muscles, and a lot of it he learns on his iPad, to be frank. And then we continue to do feeding therapy with his wonderful occupational therapist. And we play games where we'll pick up, I'm in the therapy, so as a service dog, it's like, it's kind of a party. Like, we'll play games where we'll pick up something with our mouth and like walk across the room and spit it into a bowl and like have little competitions, and I make a fool of myself, and like, we don't talk about food in normative ways of like, this is a good food, this is a bad food, or this is gross or good. It's like, this is crunchy and green and very like
just very objective. Yeah
and sometimes, like, because he's regulated, because he's just spent like a half an hour on a hammock swing and crash pad and like all the sensory input, he's regulated in his body, so he's open to experimenting a little bit, and it fluctuates. But sometimes like he just asks for carrots and pepperonis this week because it came up in his food therapy and he tasted it and realized he liked it. But it really fluctuates. It's like a very, like, how I think of his development with food and a lot of other things is like, it can feel like this infinity symbol of like, we move forward, we move back, we move forward, we move back, but it's like on this like really shallow linear path of like, little by little he's getting to a different place. And I think as he gets older and understands more the science, like, he'll be motivated, and that's what that's the only thing that works is if he wants to do something, if he has autonomy. So Well, so we're just patient.
God bless you, for sure. Well, and then the other thing I always think, so you have a younger son, and is it difficult? Because honestly, a lot of the things that you're explaining, particularly with the feeding, are sort of this more, like we talked about, more hands-off, more autonomy left for the child. I think as I'm listening, to me, it's more like the pushback or the negative consequences of not being that way are so much more amplified for your son than maybe for a more neurotypical child. But the actual sort of mindset to me is really similar for what might create that sort of autonomous, peaceful situation for a more neurotypical child. Which your younger son, does he have any other sort of diagnoses, or does he? Or is he just okay? So then I think, like, what is that like parenting both of them? Because I think that my guess is there's some strategies that you use that you find are super useful for both your children, and then there's other things where I think, I mean, as having 4 kids, like the idea of something being unfair or not the same is legitimately like a real conversation that happens multiple times a day, every day at my house. How do you navigate having one child that's neurodivergent, one that's not, and then having to change your parenting styles without, one blowing up that it's not fair?
Okay. So this is really difficult. both in my household, but also for other parents. And I think the key point is that one of my children has a disability and one does not. And so, reminding myself of that, reminding my husband or him reminding me of that, and also communicating it with our children. So my young 3-year-old will ask me questions like, why does Cooper get screen time now? Or, why does Diesel, our service dog, go in the car with him to school? And, I try and talk to him about disability and nervous systems and differences. And, some of it might register, but most of it probably doesn't. And so we have lots of meltdowns, and I have to manage that.
Yeah.
But I'm creating, hopefully, a family culture of equity, not equality, just because they're not the same. I think specifically to your question, though, it's really, really hard in practice, right? Like some days I'm too tired to hold the boundary with my younger son, and I just let him eat the same crap.
Yeah. Well, I think that's every younger child's lifestyle for an extent. Like at some point they're just like, why does, my 7-year-old be like, why does he get to do that? I'm like, because he's 13. And then eventually I'll just be like, just do it. I'm tired. So I assume it's even that more difficult for you. But I related to that, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's difficult for anyone, but in those particular situations, especially with a younger child where these are very complex, high-level concepts to understand, which on one end I feel like there's something in children that can somehow inherently understand those things a little bit better than even an older child. But on the flip side, there's other things where it's too complicated of a concept sometimes for a young kid to really fully grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my younger son does implicitly or intrinsically get that there's a difference, but in the moment when he doesn't want to sit at the table or eat more healthy food, it can depend on my level of regulation, how well I keep the boundary. And I will say my au pair has been fantastic with this, because when my older son Cooper is at school, she does not allow screens during meal times, and they cook together, and she somehow gets him to eat rice and beans and different things that I think he wouldn't eat for me. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because I was somewhat traumatized by setting really hard boundaries with my older son, and so even though I know that my younger son's 3-year-old reactions are developmentally appropriate, it triggers in me I'm going to traumatize him. So it's complex for sure.
Yeah. I mean, feeding, it seems like something so simple, but I think it's just so ingrained and psychologically and emotionally more important and more relevant than we even realize. And so my heart goes out to you, but I understand what you're saying. So this has been lovely. I feel like it's been super educational for me. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I want to make sure anybody who maybe some of this resonates with, or are considering that they may be dealing with a diagnosis or know that they have a diagnosis of PDA autism, I certainly want to have everybody check out all of your resources. You do coaching. You said you have a wait list now, so very popular with coaching. But so At Peace Parents is your website, your Instagram, and you do a podcast, PDA Parents.
Yeah. So we have there's two resources. One is more of a community advocacy and podcast, which is with my dear friend and colleague, and that's called PDA Parents. So we have a list of all the practitioners in the U.S. who are working in this field, and resources that are PDA friendly. It's all free. So, and there's writing on there, and parents are invited to contribute if that's of interest. And that is also an Instagram. PDA Parents. And then, yes, my business is At Peace Parents, and I do personalized coaching, and also I do have some group coaching cohorts, a connection cohort that I run almost monthly. So it's at a lower price point if anybody's interested.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think finally, what I wanted to ask you was, what is your advice for parents? Maybe they don't know if they're dealing with PDA or autism at all, but they just feel like they're in a place where, they're not finding that the traditional avenues, or maybe the help that's being suggested for them, it doesn't seem to be helping. What's your suggestions for parents that are maybe sort of in that situation?
Yeah, I think what I say to a lot of my clients, and this is based in my previous life, is it's an empirical question. It's not a philosophical one of just for most kids it can work like this, and values have been born out of what the societal norms are, but if it's not working for your kid, follow your intuition and engage in trial and error, and don't judge yourself. It doesn't mean just because the books aren't applicable to your child that your child or you are wrong. It just means you might need to write a different book because it hasn't been written yet. And just, speak your truth. You'll find other people who are hiding behind the shame of what this is, of the external indicators looking like you're a terrible parent, of, my kid only eats potato chips and screams in my face in public, isn't something that people like to broadcast, but it's part of neurodiversity and development. And then the other thing I would say is focusing on connection, incorporating more play and more connection time with your kid, and even talking about it. I notice you're having trouble at dinner. I wonder if there's anything we could do to make it easier. See what they say.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for the work you do, and thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Absolutely. We'll chat soon.